It's both joy and honor to be a part of the second Global Dalai Lama Vision Summit. My name is Thupten Jimpa, and I've had the privilege to be His Holiness the Dalai Lama's long-term translator. Today, I'll be speaking more specifically about the topic of compassion, which is, of course, one of the key themes of this Global Dalai Lama Vision Summit. I'll be also speaking more specifically about how can we make compassion a more active force in our own life as well as in the world. Now, many of you are aware that promotion of compassion has been one of the greatest missions of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. I've had the privilege to accompany him as his principal interpreter to so many different countries in different parts of the world. And in many of these travels, one of the things that he really looks forward to is the engagement with general public. And these are primarily organized through the platform of arranging large public talks for him, where he can not only share his thoughts and ideas and visions for the world, but also offer a general public an opportunity to interact with him in the form of asking questions and answers. So one of the amazing things that His Holiness has really achieved through his many years of sort of missionizing for compassion is really what I would call naturalize the language around compassion. Because historically, societies everywhere has really viewed compassion in a very elevated terms, turning it into, in the religious context, as a major attribute of the Almighty Divinity, the God. For the Buddhist, of course, alongside wisdom, compassion is one of the most important virtues that as practicing Buddhist one can cultivate. And also of the three attributes of the Buddha, one is compassion, the other one is wisdom, and the third one is energy or ability. And in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, these three attributes, enlightened attributes of the Buddha, are envisioned in the anthropomorphic forms of three meditation deities of Manjushri, Avalokiteshvara, and Vajrapani. So clearly, compassion has been a focus of human society for thousands of years, originally in the framework of religious belief systems. What His Holiness has done as part of this global mission is to really bring out the discourse on compassion, the concept of compassion, the philosophy of compassion, the psychology of compassion, if you want, really out of the specific context of the religious framework and bring out the universal dimension of that, concept. And scientists often talk about naturalization. When science gets involved in exploring a particular phenomenon, they develop a language around that phenomenon because they need to be able to talk about it, they need to be able to measure it. So the language that is used to describe scientific approach is sometimes called naturalization. So His Holiness really has been instrumental in what I would call naturalization of the language around compassion. And the way in which he has done it has been really skillful. One of the things that he has done is to really, first of all, bring home powerfully the commonality of teaching on compassion across the traditions. So that you can see, for example, whether it is Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Judaism, or Jainism, or Sikhism, or any other forms of, including Native American traditions. When it comes to grounding the central teachings of ethics, in other words, how to lead a good life, the foundation in all these traditions turn out to be the principle of compassion. It's no surprise that when the ethical principles are distilled, it comes down to the golden principle: do unto others what you would wish others do to you. Don't do unto others what you do not wish others to do unto you. So this golden principle really captures this fundamental principle of compassion, where as you act in the world, you need to take into account other people, the impact of your behavior on them, your responsibility towards them, your shared humanity with others. And that, in a nutshell, is the principle of compassion. So while pointing out the commonality of the emphasis on compassion as a foundation for ethics across the world religions, His Holiness has also reminded us that in some sense, compassion transcends the specificity of the teachings of the world religion. In other words, compassion is a universal teaching. And if there is one spiritual principle that is universal, it has to be compassion. So His Holiness has been really a pioneer in really kind of, refining and fine-tuning the discourse on compassion to a point where it is really sort of, brought to the level of shared human experience, a universality of human experience, where it doesn't really matter whether you're a Buddhist or a Hindu or Christian or Jew or Muslim or a non-believer. When you listen to the Dalai Lama's teachings on compassion, you will immediately recognize that what he's talking about, because in the end he's talking about fundamental human spiritual quality. So, and of course, part of that mission for him in opening up the discourse on compassion, making it more accessible, making it more universal, making it more grounded to shared human experience of everyday human beings like you and me. He has also brought science as an ally, because one of the advantages of bringing science as a participant in the discourse is that scientists will use a language that is more grounded in measurable human reality. Because in the end, if science cannot measure, science cannot get involved in that phenomenon, exploration of that phenomenon. To make it real for the scientist, you have to measure. And His Holiness's argument is that, in fact, from a scientific point of view, one needs to argue that compassion is a biologically inherited quality that we all share as part of our social nature. So, as we begin this global vision, Dalai Lama vision, I think it would be really helpful to right at the beginning to acknowledge and to celebrate and also to appreciate His Holiness Dalai Lama's amazing contribution to really opening up this discourse and thinking about compassion in a way that is truly grounded in fundamental shared human experience. So I had the privilege, as I mentioned earlier, of being so close to him, having the privilege to serve him as his principal interpreter, assisting him also on some of his major book projects. I would identify, of course, among others, 3 key elements to the Dalai Lama's, promotion of compassion in this universal sense or universal way. One is to really, right from the beginning, draw attention to the power of compassion. And this is, to use the Buddhist language, to help us develop awareness of the power of compassion when it shows up in our lives. Because although compassion is a natural human experience, often we do not pay attention to it. We leave it at the level of response. When situations triggers, it arouses in us. And then when the situation ends, we move on. We don't pay attention. So one of the things that His Holiness does is to really bring our attention to the importance of compassion in our life. To use another language, a word, to show the power of compassion. And here he talks about how if we are serious about happiness, which is as we should be, because in the end, one of the fundamental drives of human beings is to seek happiness and to overcome suffering. And if that is our fundamental pursuit, then His Holiness's argument is that the smartest way to do that is to take compassion seriously, because compassion is the key to happiness. So he speaks a lot about the power of compassion. For example, when compassion arises, he talks about how it opens an inner door, making you more spacious even within yourself, and creating a more space so that courage steps in. so that even in relation to your own problem, which may have previously seemed challenging and unbearable, but because when you look at it from the lens of compassion, then you see that suffering and problem with a sense of proportion. And paradoxically, by creating space for others in our heart and not being fixated on self-centered goals and narrowing our pursuit through self-centered vision, paradoxically, we enhance our own well-being. So that's a beautiful way of, even fulfilling our own personal self-interest and well-being. And that's the beauty of compassion. Of course, to be genuinely compassionate action, it should not be motivated by pursuit of self-interest. But at the same time, there is nothing wrong in acknowledging that when compassion does arise, which is focused on others' well-being, that there is also a sense of well-being and fulfillment on your part. Researchers and scientists and especially economists talk about this. It's a warm glow effect. So when you act in a genuinely kind way, there is a kind of even in the brain, there is an elevation of certain types of chemical processes because you feel high. Of course, a truly compassionate person does not do compassionate acts or altruistic acts because they're looking for that high. But at the same time, the fact does remain that when you are able to truly act out of compassion, there is this elevation. And not only yourself, but when others see it, they also get elevated. And it's called moral elevation. Because when you see someone else doing a compassionate act, you feel elevated too. So there's a kind of a contagion effect. So that's the power of compassion. And also, not only in relation to your own suffering and situation, compassion is the power, but compassion also opens the door for a much more healthy and constructive relationship with others in your life, and even to the world, I would argue. So, recognizing the power of compassion and paying attention to it when it shows up, being more aware of it, that's an important part of His Holiness's advocacy. And His Holiness often, in one of his very, very early talks, he talked about how, the power of compassion, both as a recipient as well as a source of kindness for someone, needs to be acknowledged. So, and the reason for that is, for example, he says that when we are first born in our infancy, we rely entirely on someone's compassion, someone's kindness, someone's love. Without that love, without that kindness, without that compassion, we just wouldn't even survive. And furthermore, he reminds us that the science has shown that during the first few weeks after the birth, the development of even the physical size of the brain of the infant is so influenced by physical contact with the mother, the caregiver, just flesh to flesh contact really creates a sense of security for the child, and which facilitates a genuinely healthy attachment bond between the caregiver, the mother, and the child, which then creates that basis for the child to be later in life to be able to show the same thing to others. So that's who we are. And then later on, when we are in our final days, in our final decades at the end of our life, again we rely heavily on others' help. So he asked the question, if that is how our life starts, and that's how our life ends, where in both of these stages we are so heavily dependent on others' care and kindness and compassion, why do we pretend that in between that we can be autonomous? We don't need other people's love. And that, I think, is a powerful statement. It is common sense, but sometimes we forget to connect the dots. That's what His Holiness is doing. He's connecting the dots.